You're listening to the Michael Harding podcast for Halloween 2021. Your fierce welcome. The Laughing Buddha is a series about Tibetan Buddhist teachings, and the Laughing Buddha, the next section, will be going up on All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day is on Monday of this coming week, and then Tuesday is All Souls' Day. I love these 2 days. We think about Samhain, opening up to the other world, the portal of what it is to live more deeply than just on the surface in this empirical mess of samsara. So I'll be doing that for Monday or Tuesday, hopefully. And for now, this is the Halloween. This is the Halloween podcast from Michael Harding. What I've done is put together my 7 favourite stories. And the remembrance of ghosts is what Halloween is all about. And so I'm offering you this little podcast for Halloween 2021. I hope you enjoy it. 7 memories, 7 ghosts, 7 stories. Thank you for being here. When Bridget was a child, her father, long dead, appeared to her in the bedroom to advise her that a cow was calving. Out she got, and down she went to the barn. And sure enough, she was there in time to assist in the delivery. She fell in love with a man on a bike, because no one else had a bike at the time. But he also played in a band. She used to go out with him, the accordion and trumpet strapped onto the rear seat, her on the bar, wheeling through the night to far-off dance halls. She married him, and her life was full of music. And 60 years later he still made her smile. How he used to straighten his dicky bow before he entered the dance hall. That was the moment she fell in love with him. She told me all this when I was driving her from the nursing home where her husband was dying. I drove her up the winding mountain path to the cottage she lived in, and I waited as she took a large key out of her pocket and turned it in the rusty lock. And we went in, and she proceeded with matches to light the lamp, pumping the little handle as she held the flame to the paraffin wick. "Do you know," she said, "I only used his bike once. It was in winter, and the land was waterlogged, but I cycled 7 miles to get a tooth pulled." She admired dentistry. "And we were poor. I saw a man used to come here in the evenings," she said, "to listen to the music, and he would light his pipe with a coal from the fire, and then he'd leave the house an hour later with the same coal in his pocket." "But," she said, smiling at the cat that rubbed itself against her feet, "the bike was the makings of us." She showed me a picture of her husband, standing erect with his comrades, all musical weapons at hand, and her elbow moved across the surface of the glass, taking a little grime from it so that I could see more clearly the gallant musician in his bicycle clips and dicky bow. And I left her there, the comrade of her life, dying in his sleep 50 miles away. Yet as she closed the door on me, I felt she was not in the slightest bit lonely in her cottage of paraffin lamps and old photographs. It struck me that she was glad to see the back of me, so that she could be alone and feed the cat. Over the years, she sometimes manifests in my dreams as a wise old woman, and sometimes I travel past where she used to live, up the winding roads and laneways of her musical life, and the townlands they cycled through long ago, and I see such enormous houses now, with patio doors and wrought iron gates, and cut stone walls, and sleek black cars. But Bridget is no more. My second favourite story. Phil Bernard, too, is long dead. I knew him 30 years ago. He lived in the hills alone in a 2-story house, with his tin whistle, his conjuring tricks, his deck of cards, and his mysterious picture of a lady with a German shepherd dog. The eyes of both the lady and the dog followed the observer round the room. Magician and entertainer, jam-jar bottled glasses, brown hair in a wave that Elvis Presley would have been proud of. Phil Bernard was the star of the show. His house was full of derelict rooms, and the local children said, perhaps unfairly, that his hair was full of boot polish. A musty kitchen, the smell of turf, the dirty frying pan, and a strip of yellow fly paper hanging from the ceiling. And in the middle of it all, this erect dapper in a 3-piece brown herringbone suit. The suit may have been a bit shiny in spots, but there was no doubt that from his appearance Phil Bernard was a performer and a professional. He played tin whistle as if it were a saxophone, jigs and reels if you wanted them, though he was happiest with big band numbers. He often dispensed with the whistle, preferring to sing out the chorus with the physicality of the lead in a Broadway musical. Phil Bernard was the original jazzman, the only jazzman in Gowlan, Cornaha, or Glangevlin. He often stood at the back door in a storm, where he kept his stack of empty porter bottles, and looked out on the ash saplings clinging to the ditches and the rushes clinging to the hill, and his face would darken. And he'd say to me, "Jeepers, Michael, aren't we living in an awful goddamn part of the world, to be sure?" I sometimes imagined that the trolley bus of reincarnation that takes people from the other world to this life and back again simply delivered Phil Bernard to the wrong address. His ticket was for New York or Boston, not a wind-swept ditch in the remote mountains of West Cavan. He used to whisper Carnegie Hall like a mantra, bringing it into existence by saying it. His dream would have been an open stage, the instrument resting by his side, the audience on their feet, and he, the performer, the star, taking a grave and deep and humble bow. But it's not what he got. Instead, he got public houses, parish hall concerts, and wedding receptions. But every song he sang as if he were truly on the stage in Carnegie Hall, and the children who said he had boot polish in his hair invited him to all their weddings, and they loved him without measure. I saw him some years before he died. The kitchen was darker. He sat on a seat of an old Morris Minor, staring at the wall. He was white-haired and blind. We talked about telephones. By then the neighbours' children and the children of their children were in Queens and Brooklyn. But they rang him up the night Sinead O'Connor played New York and promised to send him the tapes. Phil Bernard never stopped loving music. He died in a nursing home in County Fermanagh. The trolley bus took him away again, took him on to another world, another reincarnation or destination. All I pray for is that just once they get it right up there, and that the next time round they drop him in New York, in the goddamn right spot, and that someone puts a goddamn good instrument in his hands, and that he gets applause without end. Number 3. We are all haunted by certain people who have died. It may be an uncle or an aunt that we hardly knew. It may be a neighbour from our childhood. But no one is entirely isolated from the influence of ghosts. And as time goes by, people who are still alive begin to haunt us. The past catches up with us. The heart remembers mourning. The chance encounters that happened long ago. The passing strangers. The old friends. And those with whom we stood for a moment at a crossroads, wondering might we fall in love. If we don't talk to them, we go mad. Our mind stream becomes like a belfry of unwanted bats. We end up demented, scattered, distracted. My ghosts come to me like guides, angels to protect me. They whisper in my head at the most unexpected hours of the day and night. They come in random order, without significance, without any rational meaning or messages. And yet each of them throws some light on me now. They are simple presences that harbour me in moments of uncertainty. These ghosts are my friends. Andy, for example, lives in America. Went out there 50 years ago as a boy. Worked in hardware stores and is now almost retired. He has a daughter living in Greenwich Village, a nephew at college, and his daughter's boyfriend makes movies. Little movies, and promotional videos for perfumes. From poor beginnings, he carved out a life. With his family around him, retirement will mean the sidewalks and public parks of New York and New Jersey with the grandchildren. The thought of finally coming back to Ireland has no attraction. It ain't home no more. He remembers with pride being at the first run of Philadelphia Here I Come on Broadway. He drove a broken-down banger all the way into the city, and he remembers the disgust in the eyes of the valet outside the theatre as his machine rumbled up in the line of black limos. When he got out, he handed over the keys to the valet, and the valet said, "You want me to park it, sir, or just dump it?" Nowadays, his local Hibernian club organises coach trips. It's 40 minutes into Manhattan. You get a Broadway show, a drink, and you don't have to worry about the journey home. So I asked him, was he at Dancing at Lunasa? He was. We saw it when the Irish cast were in town, he said. That was when to see it. He spoke of the bus trip home that night, the lights of New York floating past the window pane. His astonishment at the beauty of the play and how he fell into a reverie of his own memories of childhood and his own school days. In particular, the memory of a frail little schoolgirl, shy and always frightened. One day in that old picture postcard Ireland of his memory, the school teacher found the little girl to be in error with her sums. So he got the old clock that lay in the corner and from which the guts had been dragged out, and he put it on her head. Then he took a tongs from the fire, and he placed the tongs in her hand. "Get up on the table," he commanded. So she hopped from the floor to the chair to the table, and there he forced her to sit on a suitcase, with the tongs in her hand and the empty clock on the crown of her head. He got the other scholars to dance around her in a circle and made them bow down and kiss her feet, because he explained among all the dunces she was the queen of the dunces. They danced, they kissed her feet, and she shivered on the tabletop like a rabbit frozen in the beam of a car's headlamp. We were talking in a diner in Manhattan over a breakfast of pancakes and over-easy eggs. There was a soft drizzle enveloping the cars and the pedestrians outside the window. I had been to the Brian Friel play the night before. I know that the memories in dancing at Lunasa are warmer and more endearing than those that my friend shared with me. And I suspect that people who have lived half a century in exile from their homeland may relish the warm nostalgia of Brian Friel's play. But why did my friend recall that particular incident? I asked. Oh, he said, the little girl in question is an elderly lady now. She works here in the city, in a bookstore, and in fact the night I was at the play, just by chance, I bumped into her in the foyer at the interval. And because the play was so much about memory and childhood, I couldn't resist going over to her. I said, "Lady, you've haunted me for 60 years. He sipped his coffee, smiled at me a broken, half-hearted smile, and stared out the window for a long time. Number 4. The River Erne is a long roadway from Cavan to the sea. It passes out of the Irish Republic just beyond Belturbet and swells into the great twin lochs that form the core of County Fermanagh. The lochs, upper and lower, are deep and wide, and the current flows strong and blue. The local boat is called a cot. It ferried cattle. It ferried people. It floated down silently in the black night, searching salmon or moving goods across the border for traders, unbeknownst to the police of either jurisdiction. On the islands, people made poaching. On other islands, they grazed their cattle all summer long. And on some islands, families or even little communities lived out their days, brought forth children, fed them, schooled them, all on those little islands in the middle of Loch Erne. I had one friend I used to visit on such an island. She was the last of her people, the last to live on her island, after 300 years, after growing up in a family of 12 other children. She saw them leave, her brothers and sisters one by one, for husbands and wives on the mainland. But she didn't marry. She was a shy woman in a sort of a way. She remained at home on her island. Then one night her house went on fire, and only by the quickness of her dog's alert did she waken and manage to crawl from her bed through the smoke and out the front door. There was no fire brigade to call. There were no neighbours to call. She sat in the bushes and watched the flames leap and devour the little home that she had and her people had lived in for centuries. In the morning, at first light, a farmer on the mainland saw the black shell still smouldering. He alerted his neighbours, and soon boats were floated, and in no time at all they were at the door of the house, a house destroyed. They thought she must have burned inside, until they realized that she was hiding in the cowshed, wearing only a threadbare cotton nightdress. All day on the mainland the talk was of the fire, and how it was not good for an old woman to be there on her own, and how she'd be far better off and safer if she signed herself into a nursing home. But the lady of the island forcefully dismissed that option as being out of the question. And in the fullness of time, people on the mainland respected her wish. With a flotilla of little boats and cots and cruisers, they ferried blocks and cement, timber and glass, hammers and nails across the waters of the loch. And out in the middle on an island, they worked like a gang of pioneers in an American West, from dawn to dusk, so that in less than 2 weeks the woman of the island was rehoused. That night she took in crates of porter and beer and bottles of whisky and fiddles and flutes, and they danced round her kitchen till the dawn came up on the lake. It was 5 o'clock, and the sun was already high in a blue summer sky, when everyone went to the water's edge, shook and hung over, and marvelled at the water all around them, the blue of it, the flow of it, that sense of being in another world, simply because they were standing on an island at the dawning of a beautiful day. When they were leaving that morning in their boats, everyone felt it must be a beautiful thing to live on an island alone with the birds. But it was the old woman they remembered, her frightened face as she hid in the cowshed in her threadbare nightdress. It was the old woman they could never forget. And story number 5. For many years, when the Tinkers were travelling on the roads, they used to stay with one another for company. For weeks or months they idled the days and the nights, staring into the fire and taking mugs of tea, and the children playing games with one another. And then they'd get up, and one of them would decide to go to one part of the country and the other would go to another. So they'd split up, and it might be 3 months or 6 months until they'd meet again, and they'd stay as long more with one another. The Irish travellers tried to carry out that lifestyle as long as they could. That's why they travel. It's not simply that they like going round in circles in high-ace vans. It's all a question of community fabric, relatedness, making connections, a complex web of social interaction that's very fabric of life, the very fabric of their culture. I know an old woman who was born on the side of the road, and then her mother died when she was only 3 months old, and her father reared 10 children. They got no schooling, no unemployment benefit, nothing. But he was a travelling man, and he took them through Galway and Clare and Kerry. He lived the simple life of the tinker, though he himself had fought in the First World War. He often told the story to his children at the campfire, how the trenches had turned him into a weather-beaten veteran, so that when he returned home in 1919 he found his parents at the roadside, but they didn't recognize him. So the soldier stayed home and got married to a 14-year-old girl who had 10 children by him until she died at 40 years of age. A soldier who reared his 10 chicks on the roadside. He would be at the fire there playing a mouth organ, and he'd be telling you of the countries and places he was in, Salonika and Egypt and France and Germany. He'd sit down and explain that he was in trenches and there would be any amount of soldiers shot, and he got frostbitten hands and feet out of the army, could put his hands in the fire and it would make no difference. But she said he was broken-hearted all his life. And as a child at the campfire, she would sing Mary of Moreau, and he would remember his wife in the singing. He kept all his children together. He'd part with none of them. he would say, "Sure, when I can get a bit for one, I can get a bit for the whole lot." He died at the age of 76, an Irish soldier who fought in the First World War, a man who was broken-hearted for decades, a traveller who knocked on the doors of the settled people, begging money for food and drink, a tinsmith who made mugs called pin saucepans and small ones for the children called pannikins, and lanterns. He used to make lanterns in the winter tent to put a candle in. As he sat with his frost-bitten hands looking into the fire, making music and conjuring up the ghosts of Gallipoli and telling them the story of his great war in defence of small nations. Number 6. I lived for a short while in the county Fermanagh, by the shores of Lough Erne, and I met people who were haunted by love. A dangerous song. "Ignore that voice and you'll soon be lying in the ditch with a long-range rifle, waiting for your neighbour." At times the fields were drenched with blood. The young men demented, astray, and distracted with rage, exhausted from overdosing on logic and history. A Shakespearean world of headless bodies, dead fathers, and shadows at the window, the Corlew hovering like a disembodied soul. The fields a nightly battleground of the dead. And when I left that small theatre of Ulster's troubles, I was relieved to discover that I was haunted not by the broken faces of the dead, but by the lovely music of two brothers who grew up on the loch shore long before I was born. Even as children, these two boys looked after each other. If one went fishing, the other would go along just to keep an eye on him. If one was riding the big mare, the other would fuss along behind, telling him to go easy. When they were young men, they travelled on bicycles to other villages in search of women. But if one had an interest in a particular lady, the other would have an equal acclaim. In the latter end, neither of them married. They remained after their parents died in a Spartan house, with a clean scrubbed table and a fiddle hanging on the wall. If the fiddle ever came down off the wall, the other would open a drawer and take out a flute, wet it and pet it, unperturbed by the fiddly jigs. The flute was coaxed into life, and then it met the fiddle at the turn of the jig, and the two of them went off together in a hornpipe, as graceful as two horses trotting the road in step. People said they could play tunes like birds, in unison with the flight of geese. They were one at all times, meaning that the harmony between them was beyond human intelligence. Except for apples, one of them loved apples, the other couldn't keep an apple down. The apple lover was at home one night, the other was on the loch. It was winter, there was ice. In a deep sleep the apple lover heard a voice. He woke. He could still hear it. In the frosty air it travelled from the middle of the lake, from where the brother was caught in ice far out, couldn't reach the shore, couldn't walk on the cold ice. He called his brother, the one who couldn't keep an apple down, and his brother heard him, and his brother answered the call. Pulled out a boat from under the willows at the loch shore, pulled it in on the soft ice, took a pitchfork to break the frozen water, made it deep into the white lake, deep but not deep enough. Following the faint cries of his brother, the boy who loved apples. In the morning their boats were found, 2 men frozen to death. The boats were so close together that their prows were touching. Number 7 in my favourite memories. The ghosts of yesterday. When my friend Julia McDonough, a travelling woman, was getting married many years ago, she was 17, and there was no reception or engagement party, and the morning of her ceremony an old barn brack ring was put on her finger. There was no fancy dress either, just a rug. A grain of wheaten flour was thrown over her after the church. That was the flakes she had. She walked into life with a new husband, with a pair of rubber boots, with a tartan rug around her, and she was happy and lucky for over 50 years. Lucky in love and in children and in grandchildren. I see engagement parties nowadays, she says to me, and the wasted food put in black bags for the dump men. Well, she says, if the poor children abroad had that out in Africa, they'd ate it and let their little ears back to it. If you only had a cut of dry bread and a cup of tea, she says, or a potato and a grain of salt. If you had comfort and peace, wouldn't you have enough? True, I agreed. But she says the young women nowadays, and the young men today, they don't know what they want. They want to be up in the moon all the time. Well, she says, I'm telling you, it's hard to keep up in the moon at all times, no matter how plenty the money is. And then Julia gave me a crystal clear illustration of this truth. I was breastfeeding one day, she says, not a year old. I breastfed them all. I was after giving her mashed potatoes, and then I gave her a little drink out of the breast, and she went to sleep, God speed her, and then I seen her all changing. She turned purple, the feet and the lips and the hands and the nails and the fingers. And my sister said, send down for your husband, she said, and I'll have the pony tackled because that child is dying. Well, going along the road in the pony and cart, the child was sucking the breast, and I pulled the breast away from her to make sure she was sucking, and the child followed it. And that's how I knew all along that the child was still alive. But going in the front door of the surgery, didn't she let one little squeal, and she stretched out in my arms. She was gone to heaven. We brought her to Mullingar Hospital, and she was waked, and we got a little coffin and a little white dress, and we buried her in Mullingar graveyard. And apart from that one tragedy, Julia was lucky in love, in children and in grandchildren. She had her share of fun. But as she says herself, the child in the coffin is the rag on the bush, it's the comb on the ditch, it's every young girl on the street. The child in the coffin can never be buried, and you can't be up in the moon at all times. I always feel very moved when I think about Julia. And I think about Andy in America. I think about all the people in those stories, Phil Bernard and Bridget. I suppose in a way, some of those stories you've heard before, some of them I've read before or referred to, but in a way, they become more real to me as I get older. And I realized that those people were present in a kind of special way, the way that you have a guide in life, the way that you meet somebody who changes your life. And in that sense, they're like angels. Every one of them, the old man, Phil Bernard, the travelling woman, the travelling man who fought in the First World War, they've come to me as stories, and yet the story carries to me an angel, a messenger who changes my life because of their story. I think that's one of the ways that I feel I connect with Halloween. Halloween is the eve of the holy day, the day of all saints, and the day of all souls, the following day. The day that they call, the Day of the Dead, because it's a time to remember the dead. But I remember them as living. I remember all those who have gone before me, marked with the sign of faith. My father, mother, dear friends, ancestors. To me, they're all a communion of saints. I just believe in the butterfly. I believe more and more as I get older that there's something about death which is not death, which is more like transformation. And if the caterpillar can become a butterfly, if that transformation can be so complete that there seems to be no connection between one and the other, then I'm open to the possibility that death is a doorway into a deeper way of living, a deeper mystery of being in the cosmos. Maybe without the cage of the egoic self. Maybe that falls apart the same way as the body does. But that when you unknot the soul, there is the unique you and the unique me, which even without personality, specific ego, maintains itself in the cosmos, in the presence of eternal being. It's not that unscientific nowadays. What's really unscientific nowadays is to think of all life as just material, as just on the surface, just empirical and just rational. There are other aspects to being here. And so for me, Halloween is about that kind of remembrance and gratitude for the angels in my life, the guides in my life, who have gone beyond us, before us, and maybe been transformed into wonderful beings. Who knows? I think I'm transformed and you're transformed in every moment. I think the possibility of you or me being a wonderful being, transformed now in this moment, is the key to living every moment, actually. There's a kind of an infinite transformation possible in every second, and every moment is a Bardo moment. I'll talk more about that on Monday, I hope, when I'll be reflecting, doing the final in the series The Laughing Buddha, and that's going to happen on Monday. So I hope you like that. For now, I hope you have a very, very happy Halloween. We're going into November, a time to reflect about candles and darkness and light. Be well, and thank you for being here. Bye-bye.